Welcome to the audiobook of The Great Housing Hijack. Distractions and Distortions, Chapter 13, Skipping the Cycle. A quote. By 2007, Britain and most of the other industrially advanced economies will be in the throes of frenzied activity in the land market. Land prices will be near their 18-year peak, on the verge of the collapse that will presage the global depression of 2010. End quote. That was from Fred Harrison in his 1997 book, Chaos Makers, predicting that a frenzied property market cycle in the 2000s would precede a global depression in 2010. May 2020 was near the peak of the COVID-19 policy panic. Australian banks had released analysis showing the possibility of 30% declines in the price of housing assets, worrying many. At this exact time, in a podcast entitled Australia Housing Market Bull versus Bear Debate, I argued they were wrong. I explained why prices were more likely to rise 20% than fall 20%, despite concerns about unemployment, lockdowns, and enormous economic disruption. I was called mad. People on social media asked if I'd got my university degrees from a cornflakes box. I was going against the forecasts of the Reserve Bank of Australia, the guidance of all the major banks, and just about every media housing analyst you could poke a stick at. That same week, ABC News ran the headline, CBA warns Australia risks 32% house price crash in a prolonged downturn, flags $1.5 billion coronavirus hit to the bank. But I was right. Housing asset prices for all dwellings across the 5 biggest capital cities boomed by 20% in the next 18 months. On the dot. To their peak in 2022, housing asset prices were up 43% in Brisbane and 42% in Adelaide, with far greater price gains in many regional centres and lifestyle towns. There were a few elements to my argument, but the big three ones were these. First, an upwards impact from recently reduced interest rates. Second, even a rise in unemployment and decline in household incomes would have a small percentage effect on total household incomes and hence rents. Third, property markets move in cycles. The last point confused people. If you understand the asset price equilibrium, the first makes sense. If you understand the rental price equilibrium, the second makes sense. But what many miss is the third part, the property cycle. All the equilibria move in a surprisingly regular economic cycle, or heartbeat. I knew that after a bust comes a boom, not another bust, and that rents and prices had both already fallen for 2 years and were starting to rise again. But in the hijacked housing debates, ignoring the property cycle is all too common. This section's called The Long History of Property Cycles and Forecasts. The property market pulse is well documented by the housing development industry. For decades, industry analysts have produced property clocks to place each city at its point in the recurring cycle. They aren't always right, but they fundamentally understand that the property market is tightly linked with the boom and bust cycle of the macroeconomy. In fact, the boom and bust nature of the property cycle was a huge political and economic concern in the 19th century, which had seen periodic crashes disrupt economic activity and investment. Homer Hoyt tracked the 1800s boom and bust cycle in real estate with his book 100 Years of Land Values in Chicago, the relationship of the growth of Chicago to the rise of its land values, 1830 to 1933. Roy Wenslick in 1936 wrote a book entitled The Coming Boom in Real Estate, in which he predicted with great accuracy property boom and bust cycles over the next decades. If you had been around and able to follow the advice in Ohio farmer Samuel Benner's 1875 book, Benner's Prophecies of Future Ups and Downs in Prices, about when to buy property in the late 19th and early 20th century, you would have made millions. And more recently, if you had taken seriously Fred Harrison's predictions, quoted at the start of this chapter, you would have navigated the 2000s financial crisis with your wealth intact. All of these approaches recognize that, even if it is not clear why, there are property cycles, and ignoring these repeating patterns leads to bad predictions and housing policy prescriptions. This section's called It's a Modern Mystery. The causes of property market cycles are somewhat of a mystery to modern economics. The standard explanation is that prices should be stable over time, and any change must be due to an external cause acting at random. Maybe a collective panic or a technology change, maybe new trade routes or border closures during a pandemic. Samuel Benner noticed this even in the 1870s. Experts back then thought market declines were a random occurrence driven by a sudden panic. At that time, panics in the commercial and financial world were compared to comets in the astronomical world, which were then thought to have no regularity of movement, no cycles, and hence were beyond the domain of astronomical science. My view is that just as gravity generates regular and predictable patterns among the planets and stars, the economic equilibrium forces in the property market also generate regular and predictable cyclical patterns. Like our solar system, where each planet is in an equilibrium but still moving over time, the 5 property market equilibria must always exist, but are not always fixed in place. Though it is not a perfect analogy, we can think of an asset price cycle as like the movement of the moon around the Earth, which causes rising tides, raising the level of the water, maybe that's the density equilibrium, and the flow of water into rivers and streams, the absorption rate equilibrium. Renters get a boost if they're paddling upriver when the tide comes in, the rental equilibrium falls a little, but then when the tide goes out, the paddling becomes more difficult. We know that these natural forces cause tides and cycles everywhere on the planet, and we don't look for any local explanation of this phenomenon. The 5 housing market equilibria are tied together in a system. In every property monopoly, whether it is in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, or whether it is in a board game or virtual world, these same economic equilibrium forces generate the same system-wide cycles. This section's called The Speculative Index is a Tool to Monitor Cycles. My preferred method for monitoring the property cycle is to track the asset price equilibrium with a measure I call the speculative index. It is the ratio of the mortgage interest rate to the gross yield, or the capitalization rate being a year's current gross rent divided by price. Since the force acting on the asset price equilibrium is the relative return of swapping the yield on non-property assets for property assets, this gives a feel for the state of that equilibrium at a point in time. I call it the speculative index because, when it is high, the mortgage interest cost is much higher than the rental income. It only makes sense to buy housing at this time if you expect plenty of capital gains, even for owner-occupiers who could be better off renting temporarily and investing their money in other assets. You're speculating on those gains more than buying the current rental income flow. Figure 5 shows the speculative index for Australia for the past 4 decades. And for listeners, the figure has on the x-axis the years from the early 1980s up to 2022. On the x-axis and on the y-axis, it's the speculative index. This was a free sample of the audiobook of The Great Housing Hijack. To get full access, sign up as a paid subscriber at fresheconomicthinking.com.